Recently, the Supreme Court held 5-4 that the death penalty was somehow cruel and inhuman punishment for rapists or murderers or killers of prison guards or of our police officers. For anyone, the death penalty was now somehow cruel and unusual punishment. Given the rate at which it had been enforced in this state, it was certainly unusual. Bob Lee, you're down in Washington. What effect do you think the Supreme Court ruling will have? Is there a loophole somewhere in it? These boys are usually sewing things with 100 loopholes. Will you comment?
I'm not quite sure yet just what the Supreme Court did the other day. The first news report that I heard was that they had slammed the door completely on capital punishment. The papers that were on the stands here last night said that isn't the case, that there's still a crack maybe that wide, and that under some very restrictive conditions that capital punishment could still be enforced. But I'm quite sure that this is a very powerful move in the direction of actually abolishing capital punishment. Now, it's interesting that all 9 judges on the court are opposed to capital punishment. They made that quite clear in the decision. I think Justice Berger, Chief Justice Berger, when he started to give his side of the story, was that people thought that maybe he was giving the majority opinion because of his condemnation of capital punishment. And the same with Justice Blackmun, etc. Now, this idea, well, first of all, then it's interesting, with 9 of them opposed to it, it came out 5-4, and the 4 opposed to it were the ones that Mr. Nixon appointed, which, just as a side effect, takes all the heat off Mr. Nixon, as far as this decision is concerned. Now, this idea of cruel and unusual, generally those who are the most vigorous in advocating abolition of the death penalty are the ones who, because it's cruel and unusual, will be found on the side advocating things like abortion, where they don't think it's cruel and unusual to murder tens of thousands of the unborn young. And that's a double standard that's sort of interesting. Now, you've got as far as the impact is concerned, the conservatives, if there's still a chance of retaining the death penalty, the conservatives should inform themselves about it and learn the arguments that are in favor of it. The arguments in favor of the death penalty don't get a hearing too often. And they are, I think, very strong, very overwhelming. It's said by the opposition, for example, that the death penalty is not a deterrent, which is ridiculous, because a person who's executed is deterred from committing further crimes. That's obvious right there. And if you had, one reason that it doesn't show up as more of a deterrent than it is, as Scott indicated, is that they haven't executed anybody in this country for 5 years. And it hasn't been used effectively in regard to punishing, a just punishment, for killers and rapists and others. Now, one point on this deterrence, however, is that if we assume that deterrence, that it doesn't deter at all, that still wouldn't make any difference, because deterrence is not the chief argument on the death penalty issue. The chief argument is justice. The key thing is that the person who is to be executed deserve it. If he doesn't deserve it, there's no excuse whatsoever in administering it. Deterrence is sort of icing on the cake. If by executing a person who deserves it, you deter others from committing horrible crimes, this is fine, this is well and good, but the key factor should be the justice aspect. It's sometimes argued that you might execute an innocent person. This was the one argument that really bugged me quite a bit when we were looking into this for an article that Reed and I did for American Opinion. This possibility that through the legal process you might take someone who was not guilty of a crime and execute him, and then find out later that he wasn't guilty of it. But in looking into the matter, we found out that there isn't a single known case in this country where an innocent person has been executed. Now, it's happened in other countries, but in America, there's no known cases of it happening. Now, on the other hand, now it doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. Of course, it could. We're fallible. Our judicial system is run by people who are sometimes, unfortunately, all too human. We can make mistakes. But there are no known cases of that so far under the American system of jurisprudence. On the other hand, there are scores of documented cases where individuals who are innocent of any crime, meaning, but like you and me, are being killed by criminals, killers, rapists, who, instead of being given the death penalty, were locked up in prison and then murder their guards, murder fellow inmates, or escape to kill other people. And this has been documented in scores and scores of cases. If you're balancing innocent lives, we've got to take the very clear number of innocent people that have died at the hands of murderers who have not receive the death penalty, and compare that to some hypothetical future case where an innocent man might receive the death penalty unjustly. Now, one of the results of this, very clearly, if the death penalty is abolished, is going to be a rise in, I guess you could call it, vigilantism. The purpose of our court system has been to have a very rational, orderly process of carrying out justice and giving people who are criminals just penalties. We wanted to get away from the lynch mob aspect because too often the lynch mob was extremely brutal, and too often it got the wrong person. And we've come to a more sane and more civilized system. But if these judges now make it impossible to administer a just and deserved penalty for these, especially these horrible crimes like rape and murder, you're going to find people probably taking law into their own hands in some cases. Now, 2 weeks ago, the Washington Star carried a short item which is reflective of this. There was a fellow whose brother was murdered during a holdup, and this fellow attended the trial of the killer. And he sat there while the trial went on, and the verdict came in, and the fellow was found guilty, and the judge imposed a 6-year sentence. And after the trial was over, this fellow whose brother had been murdered just calmly got up, walked down, and waited by the ramp downstairs, and when they brought the criminal out, he killed him. And this is unfortunate. Now, this fellow is up for murder, but I think you can see the point here. He lost his brother at the hands of this person, and a judge administers a sentence of 6 years, which is hardly a just sentence. So that's one of the unfortunate aspects, and I'd hope very much that conservatives would take the time to look into this matter. It's a very interesting issue. You come into some interesting questions. Bernard Cohen, in a real excellent book called Law Without Order, which deals with the death penalty, points out, for example, that why is it moral to take a person's life before he kills you, but that it is immoral to take his life after he kills you? The point being that you have the right to self-defense. Some guy comes up and he points a gun at you, and you have the right, if need be, to shoot him, or to take care of him, and to stop him, even if it takes his life. And even the worst liberal of the ACLU would say, yes, you have this right to self-defense, but the guy has committed no crime. It might not be a real gun, it might be a cap gun. Maybe he can't shoot straight, he might miss you. And he might be a fairly bad shot and only wound you, and you don't kill a guy for wounding you. And even if he kills you, he hasn't had a trial, he hasn't exhausted all his legal appeals, it's still unfair, you could argue this way. But generally we assume that you have the right to self-defense, but now it's being argued that whereas you have the right to, if need be, take a life to defend yourself before the person literally has committed a crime, the state now is not supposed to have the right to take his life after he's actually committed the crime. It's an interesting point. And the death penalty issue is replete with instances of interesting and fascinating arguments on both sides. I think the side favoring the death penalty is very overwhelming.
Are you for it or against it, Bob?
Pardon?
Are you for it or against it?
I'm very much for the death penalty, yes. You betcha. And this means that the court's decision was a bad one.